Reverb is probably one of the more important effects you can use in your audio production and music creation and mixing. Reverb is actually a natural effect that happens in the world all around us all the time. And basically it's the reflections that are produced by a sound event and make it seem like that sound is going on. They kind of add a tail or a decay to a sound you hear. If you've ever clapped your hands in a big church or a cement parking garage, you've heard a very long reverb. And if you've ever sung in a bathroom with a lot of tile, you've also taken advantage of these reflections. You sound a little bit better singing in the shower because that reflection actually makes your voice seem like it's bigger and goes on farther and a little bit smoother because of all these different reflections. So a reverb plugin is trying to recreate the effect of the reverb that happens in the real world. And we want to recreate that because it tends to make things more listenable. And when we hear things without any reverb, they can sound a little unnatural. Reverb is also important because it allows us to locate what kind of room a sound is in and where it might be in that room. We can tell if those footsteps walking across the floor are in a big gymnasium or if they're in a small room. And it also makes a lot of music more listenable. That's one of the big things when you go to big concert halls and symphonic concert halls. A lot of time and money goes into figuring out how to make those orchestra halls have a great reverb quality to them. So reverb's very important in terms of making music palatable, kind of listenable, smoothing things out, making it sound a little bit bigger and better than it is. But also it makes things seem natural to us as well. So let's take a look at using reverb for those purposes, but also now that reverb is a processing option, we can use it for lots of effects that really you wouldn't find out there in the world, but are really cool and great for adding to what we're doing. So we're going to go ahead and start by putting some reverb on a nice drum track and just messing around with it a little bit to see what kind of different effects we can get. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll use the old drum beat here. We'll solo that. Insert our friend Reverb. And most software that you work with will probably come with some sort of reverb option right off the bat. Sometimes it'll just be file level. It might not be a plugin, but there's a ton of really nice ones out there that you can buy as kind of third-party plugins. Having a quality reverb plugin goes a long, long way in terms of making your mixes sound better. They're very processor intensive because it has to calculate and simulate tons of little reflections and reproduce them pretty accurately. So there's a lot of thinking that goes into reproducing reverb. Okay, so we have the reverb plugin open, and you can see that we kind of have some different choices. They call it the algorithm, but they represent it by a room, and this algorithm is the math that figures out what kind of reflections happen in what kind of spaces. So we can simulate a church or different sizes of rooms or a plate, which is actually a man-made device that they built a long time ago to also try and simulate reverb for recordings that we actually have gotten so used to because we've heard it in so many recordings that we want to keep using it and we want to be able to have access to that type of reverb as well. So let's go ahead and feed the drums in here and see what kind of sound we have. I'll set the input to 0 and I'll start with a mix that's completely dry. Now let's add a little bit of reverb to the mix. So there we are in the church. We can switch it around to a room, and we'll start with a large room. We'll switch to a small room. Let's make that pretty wet. So we can go back and forth and pick these kind of different rooms or environments and get a lot of different interesting effects. We can try and go for nice, realistic, accurate effects and try and act like we've placed this drum set in, let's say, a small club venue, which let's go ahead and just give that a shot. Let's call it a hall, maybe a small hall. So that's cool. You kind of can imagine, maybe a small 500-person club, something like that. Or we can make it the arena. For those about to rock, we salute you. So that's reverb. You can do some pretty amazing things with it. Now let's go ahead and play with this on a voice and see what kind of effects we can get. We'll take that plug-in out. And we'll go and take a listen again to our voiceover. Now, normally you won't find yourself applying a lot of reverb to like a voiceover production, like a podcast or a broadcast or an industrial training film or something like that where you're doing voiceover, just because we want to keep that voice kind of as clear and easy to understand as possible. And sometimes adding a lot of verb makes things a little bit harder to understand when it comes to the voice. But I'm going to show you the effect we can have. You can use it on vocals in music and get great effects. It does a real nice job of kind of smoothing out the voice, and sometimes it can make it stand out more in a mix. You can use kind of special reverb effects to give it kind of a cool feel. And we'll take a look at just a couple of these things. So let's play our voice track back.
Welcome to the lynda.com video training podcast for Friday, January 19th, 2006. January 19th, 2007. This is episode 47. This week, learn to sync poser models to an audio file with a movie from Poser 7.
So there we have her kind of in a smaller room.
Welcome to the lynda.com video training podcast for Friday, January 19th, 2006. January 19th, 2007. This is episode 47. This week, learn to sync poser models to an audio file with a movie from Poser 7 Essential Training with Larry Mitchell.
Now, if you want to go back to the 80s and try and get a cool kind of vocal effect from the 80s.
Welcome to the lynda.com video training podcast for Friday, January 19th, 2006. January 19th, 2007. This is episode 47. This week, learn to sync poser models to an audio file with a movie from Poser 7 Essential Training with Larry Mitchell.
So there's a lot of different kind of effects you can get. You can use it on the voice, on vocals, on different instruments. If you're doing post-production on a film or have recorded dialogue in different places and want to try and make it sound like those people are in the room that they're actually shot in or filmed in, you can go and add some reverb slightly to kind of put them in a place. A lot of times it's hard to record someone who's at the other end of the parking garage that you were filming, but then you can have them come into the studio, record a voiceover track, and then add some reverb. So when you actually see that voice track synced up to the footage, you'll believe that actually that person is speaking in that big open space and it has that reverb. You'll know if you watch a lot of movies, sometimes they'll do an overdub and they'll have like one line in there where they're taking the swearing out or something like that. And they work pretty hard to try and match the ambience or the reverb effect of the room that person's in. But a lot of times they botch it. I don't know if they don't care, they're just doing a rush job. But you'll kind of hear the words where they edit out the swear words and you can tell it's a completely different track. But if you play around with it enough, you can probably make that sound like it took place in the same location by adding some reverb and adjusting some EQ. Reverb's also really useful for sound design in terms of sound effects, making things sound bigger than they are, making things sound farther away than they are. You really have to start to play with it and you'll get a sense of what's possible as you add effects, and it's a really interesting thing. Reverb is also really useful in sound design in terms of doing special effects because you can make things seem like they're farther away than they really are, or make them sound bigger or girthier or more dramatic than they really are. And also the type of reverb you choose can kind of dictate what people perceive the physical quality of that object is. You know, if it's a robot and you put a certain kind of reverb on its big footsteps, you can make it seem like it's this big hulking metal thing, even though it might be, an animation. There's no metal at all. It's just a bunch of drawings. So reverb can be really useful in a lot of different ways, and it can do a lot to enhance your recordings.